My topic today is to try to explain the age of confusion in which we live. There has been an election recently in the Ukraine, and many elections have given surprises. Since Donald Trump was elected in 2016, we have seen a strange thing in economic ideology. It used to be during the last 25 years since the fall of the Cold War that everybody believed that free trade would benefit every country. The surprising thing that happened in 2016 in the United States is that we had two candidates, Mr. Trump from the right and Mr. Sanders from the left, who both of them insisted that free trade was not in the interest of the United States. This is similar to what has happened earlier in history. In 1848, also free trade was attacked from both right and left, and it was not a subject for another many decades. So we have a situation where economic theory in good years, in good periods, in the rich countries becomes more and more abstract, and then there is a period when rich countries then find themselves in problems and economic theory changes. So my talk today will be about what this means for the Ukraine. What does it mean if we have an economic theory which is less abstract than the one we have today, the one represented by the IMF and the World Bank? And I think in the end, I'll try to explain why what happens in the United States, that both right and left attack free trade, should also be something inspiring the Ukraine. You should probably listen less to the IMF and the World Bank and look more to what Sanders and Trump are doing in the United States. I think the first element here is to understand that economic activities are qualitatively very different. Present economic theory, to those of you who are economists, is based on a theory by David Ricardo in 1817. And David Ricardo modeled the world and world trade on the barter of labor hours. Ricardo assumed that all economic activities were alike, and he just looked at labor hours. There is no capital in the theory, so the interesting thing is that in the capitalist theory of international trade, there is no capital, which is in a way surprising. So I think it's important for people who are interested in politics and economics to understand that economic activities are not alike. They come in three different kinds. First of all, those subject to diminishing returns to scale. Diminishing returns happens when there is one factor of production limited by nature. So it happens in agriculture, it happens in mining, and it happens in fisheries. If you have a very fertile land and produce, let's say, wheat, you will be very successful internationally, but at one point you will start producing wheat in areas that are less fertile than others. So at some point in time, if you specialize in natural resources, these natural resources will in some cases run out, in other cases you will run into diminishing returns. And there's a double curse with raw materials. First of all, you have these diminishing returns, which sooner or later happens. And secondly, they are also subject to perfect competition. which means that you read in the newspaper what the market is willing to buy for your products. So technical change in agriculture tends to come as lowered prices to the consumer, not as higher incomes to the farmers. This is a very fundamental law. And if you ask yourself, why is it that the most productive and efficient farmers in the world, in the European Union and in the United States, why do they still need so heavy subsidies? Why does the United States have to subsidize the world's most efficient farmers? Well, that is because of the double curse that I've been mentioning, because they are subject to diminishing returns and because these products are under perfect competition. Then you have a second type of activities, which are the normal service economy, service sectors. Productivity varies little with the volume of production. If you're a barber, if you paint houses, well, if you paint two houses, painting the second house is not going to cost less than painting the first house. So these economic activities are subject to constant returns to scale. Then comes the most interesting category, increasing returns to scale or economies of scale. Productivity increases strongly with larger volumes of production, and this creates high barriers to entry. I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School, and my theory of international trade is based on the theories from Harvard Business School, which tells you what industries have the highest profits. The highest profits are in the industries with high barriers to entry. So if you are Bill Gates, if you produce something called Windows 19, the first unit may cost you $500 million, just to pick a number. The second unit, if you sell it on the internet, might cost you 5 cents. Right? So if you have a cost structure with virtually zero marginal cost, you can take over the world market. In normal manufacturing industry, it is not as extreme as the situation facing Bill Gates, but it's still the volume of production which creates high barriers to entry. And what had happened in most of the 20th century was that when there was let's say a 4% productivity increase in manufacturing industry, wages went up by 4%. So manufacturing was the wage leader of all the nation, of the whole nation. So the closeness between the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector made wages go up in agriculture because the wages in the city went up, and the closeness to the city also made it possible for farmers to have tractors and the technological progress that came with these tractors. And so we see that the higher wages in agriculture are a result of the higher wages in manufacturing industry. Why is there so little technology used in agriculture on African farms? It's because labor is virtually free and capital is very expensive. So the modernizing of the agricultural sector comes as a mirror image of the modernization of the same country's industrial sector. So if you take away the manufacturing sector, you are likely also to find falling wages in agriculture. And this dependence of city and countryside was understood in the 1930s, but and it was understood for a long time, but after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was no longer understood. And there is one very important factor here. We all thought that communism and Western capitalism were two entirely different systems, and they were. I'm, in a sense, a child of the Cold War. I grew up under the Cold War. And what we did not realize was that both communism and Western capitalism was based on the cult of industries. On the slide here, you see a stamp from West Germany to the left, and a stamp from East Germany, communist East Germany, to the right. And they portray the same person, German economist Friedrich List. And Friedrich List was the theoretical economist which was behind the industrialization of the whole of the European continent. And he was translated into Russian by Sergei Witte, who was Minister of Finance under the last two Tsars, and his ideas were taken over by the communists. And if you look at the history of the Ukraine, you will recognize the cult of manufacturing industry. And many of your problems today is because this is no longer understood. The importance of manufacturing industry, also for agriculture, is not understood. And you're listening to the wrong prophets. You're listening to the IMF and the World Bank, who are still stuck with the old-fashioned model of David Ricardo. Notice that the United States no longer recognizes this model, but it still forces its virtual colonies, the world periphery, to follow this strategy where manufacturing industry means nothing. And that is my main worry with this country, that you are deindustrializing too fast. I do not think you should have bought locomotives from General Electric in the US. I think you should have built them yourselves. But you are, should we say, lured into this by a kind of economic theory that the Americans are forcing upon you, that the West Germans are forcing upon you, but that the Americans and the West Germans are not following themselves. So the United States in the 1820s used to say, don't do as the English tell you to do, do as the English did. And I think in the Ukraine you should say, don't do as the Americans tell you to do, do as the Americans did and still do. And I think there is a risk here. I just came yesterday from Armenia, and in Armenia the political political winner is also a relatively unknown person, a person with no links to politics from before, a journalist. And the worry in Armenia is similar to my worry here, that you get politicians who have little experience, but their heads have been filled by the war against corruption. Well, I think there are different kinds of corruption. There is you buying services, and there's also theft. But I heard here in Kiev a couple of years ago a Swedish representative of the European Union saying something like, well, if you in this country just get rid of corruption, the invisible hand will create economic growth. I think that is not true at all. Corruption is a problem, but do not believe that if you get rid of corruption, you will solve your problems. You still have the problem of deindustrialization, and you have the common problem with Armenia that deindustrialization causes migration. There is a very important link between the economic structure of a nation and the nation's ability to keep its population. If you remove manufacturing industry, you create migration. This was very clearly understood after World War II, when the Allied tried to deindustrialize Germany with the Morgenthau Plan. And the conclusion from US experts was that if you took away manufacturing industry from West Germany, you would have to move 25 million people out of Germany. And the question from Herbert Hoover, the old president who had been sent out to solve this, what should we do with these 25 million people? Should we exterminate them, or should we move them somewhere else? If so, where? So at the beginning of the Cold War, the understanding the link between economic structure and the carrying capacity of a nation, which seems to be forgotten here today, it was very clear. And I think you have to get rid of the very highly abstract economic theories and get back to the economic theories that reconstructed Europe after World War II. This chart was produced by Branko Milanovic, who is the former chief economist of the World Bank. This is the best data we have, and they're probably not perfect, but it indicates something very interesting. To the left, you see some countries in red whose income is now below the 1989 level. You know, these are countries that were poorer now under capitalism than they were under communism. And this is not because communism was so brilliant, it is because it's better to have an inefficient manufacturing sector than not to have a manufacturing sector at all. If we say, you know, intuitively, parents don't say to their children, my son, my daughter, you obviously have a comparative advantage in washing dishes, so go out and make a career in washing dishes. You know, intuitively, even economists don't say that to their children. They say, you know, go and get yourself an education, and they intuitively know that it's better to be a mediocre lawyer in Kiev than to be Kiev's most efficient dishwasher. And the same thing applies to nations. It's better to have an inefficient manufacturing sector than not to have any at all. And I think this has been known for centuries, really. It was discovered by an Italian economist called Giovanni Botero, who died in 1617. And it has been understood for most of the time, but not during the Cold War. An interesting thing with this graph is that you see to the right there is Belarus. And Belarus has the luxury, in a sense, of not having to listen to IMF and the World Bank, because they don't try to be democracies. You know, I'm all in favor of democracy, but I'm trying to tell you the disadvantages at this moment of being a democracy, of trying to be a democracy, is that you have to listen to the IMF and the World Bank to get credit. In 1989, wages in the Ukraine were higher than the wages in Belarus. Now, wages in Belarus are 50% higher than those in the Ukraine. And that is not because Lenin stands there on the square. It's because they can have an industrial policy. They can say, we want to produce things we're good at producing, even though they might be bought cheaper in China or somewhere else. So an interesting thing here is that the countries to the left in this graph who try to be democratic actually have a big disadvantage. So what I'm saying indirectly is that the politics of the World Bank and of the IMF is a severe threat to democracies. They force democratic countries into deindustrializing because, well, deindustrialization started with the shock therapy in the early 90s, and that the effects of this shock therapy is still going on. So if you want to have as many Ukrainians as possible to live in the Ukraine, well, you have the main variable here is your economic structure. And the more locomotives you buy from the United States and not locally, the more you force Ukrainians to leave their own country. This is a graph which looks very complicated. It's essentially presented here just to tell you how different economic activities really are. This is data from about 50 American industries from the late 1800s until the late 1930s. And you see three columns here. You have the column of the growth of output, that is the left column. You have the column with the number of wage earners, which is the black column, and then you have the column which goes down, which is wage earners per unit of production, which is the inverse of productivity. So if you look at the industry to the left, which is the automotive industry, you see that the increase in output is about 200,000%. The increase in wage earners is about 20,000%. And you see that productivity, the number of wage earners per car went down by more than 80%. So this was, in the 20th century, a unique manufacturing industry. And if you look at economic policy, all Western European countries, with the exception of Norway and Finland, had some kind of assembly plant, at least, of manufacture of cars, in order to grab part of this famous, wonderful technological change. Right. So, on the right-hand side, you have very mature industries like slaves and railway cars, where you find, at the time, you found very little technological change, because the technological change had happened earlier. And you have paraffin and hats and gloves and economic activities where not much happens. But the interesting thing here is that every European nation of any size tried to have all the economic activities to the left, right? So big countries, small countries, they all had a blend of these economic activities. And the European Union also changed its policy very radically with the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s. When Spain was integrated into the European Union in the 1980s, it was done over 10 years. It was done very gradually. Tariffs were cut about 10% a year, and they made sure that the automotive industry and all the important manufacturing industries were saved. Right. So every country was a mini version of this. Some manufacturing activities with very high technological change and some with very low. Right. So they all grew more or less in a parallel fashion. What happened after 1992 and the Maastricht Treaty was a complete change in ideology. But it's interesting to look at the main paper that led up to the Maastricht Treaty, a booklet by an Italian economist by the name of Cecchini, the so-called Cecchini Report. The Cecchini Report argues for a single market, and the main reason is the economies of scale in manufacturing industries. Cecchini argues that by making the market bigger, you will have more economies of scale, and that will lower cost and will benefit everyone. Up to 85% of the benefits from the European single market was supposed to come from increasing returns. What happened, though, was that some peripheral European countries like Greece and Portugal lost all the industries to the left and were stuck with the losers to the right, and they were stuck with service industries with no technological change. So wages in these countries were lowered, and on top of that came the euro, that in the old days, if you had lost your industry and were not competitive, you could devalue and you could start competing again. By locking the countries that lost their manufacturing industry into the euro, they also locked them into poverty. So we used to have a world, I repeat here, we used to have a world where every country of any size had all these economic activities, and the Ukraine clearly had. Then we got a global economy where some countries took all the benefits from the technical change and the increasing returns. China is now leading in that. And some countries, like the Ukraine, are left with the losers, the one with the characteristics to the right here. So this was the big difference between a nation-based world order, high productivity and low productivity manufacturers existed side by side in all countries. Now in the global economy, some economies are the winners, taking the ones to the left, and some are losers. And the interesting thing now is that even the United States is becoming a loser, like England was, and England became in the early 1900s. So the message here is, for the Ukraine, you have to defend your manufacturing industries. You had some very good policies, for instance, trying to keep your timber. Your timber should be processed here and not abroad. Your scrap iron should be processed here and not abroad. And it's interesting that the European Union is now getting into this reasoning also. They have a program called Smart Specialization. And I was hired by the European Union to write about smart specialization. And the interesting thing here is that smart specialization has a counterpart which you could call stupid specialization. And stupid specialization is selling wheat from the Ukraine for 400 euro a ton and imported spaghetti back from Italy at 4,000 euro a ton. Right? So I think if you look at your foreign trade from this perspective, it's possible to make a Ukraine where there is room for more Ukrainians. Thank you.